Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show dedicated to giving you the fastest possible route to intellectual fluency in the world's most complex subjects.
And today, we are strapping in for a conceptual thrill ride. We're going straight into the world of political philosophy.
It's the field that underpins everything, isn't it? From the most basic municipal traffic law all the way up to the highest international treaties.
Absolutely. And we're opening with this really powerful idea that humans don't just sort of inherit their governmental system.
No, we actively shape them.
We do. We engage in this continuous, often very contentious debate about how society should work.
Exactly. And you shared some truly fantastic, dense, foundational material that covers the conceptual bedrock of politics. I mean, the actual blueprints for governance. So our mission today is crystal clear. We are going to distill those essential concepts, map out the major ideological schools of thought, and, fundamentally understand the core values that truly guide political action.
Think of this as your advanced glossary, but with analysis.
Yeah, so you can walk into any debate knowing the theoretical foundations.
And this is a really crucial deep dive because it distinguishes between description and prescription. Political philosophy is, at its heart, a normative field.
Okay, what do we mean by normative?
It doesn't just describe how governments actually work. That's the realm of political science.
Right, political science is more empirical.
Yeah.
It's the data.
Exactly, it's description. Political philosophy focuses on the desirable norms and values. It deals with the shoulds.
The ideal forms.
Precisely. It explores concepts like justice, equality, and liberty, not just how they manifest, but how they ought to manifest.
So our scope today is pretty vast.
It is. We have to look at the nature, the reach, the very legitimacy of political institutions, and we're tackling these fundamental questions about the individual's relationship to the collective, and maybe most critically, how goods and power should be distributed across society.
You're really aiming for intellectual fluency in the deepest theoretical disagreements facing humanity.
That's the goal.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we dive into the heavy hitters like anarchism and liberalism, we really need a shared, precise vocabulary.
A
toolkit. Let's start with a distinction that I think often confuses people. Political philosophy versus political theory. They get used interchangeably all the time. Is there a real dividing line?
There is a subtle one, but it's important for scholars. Political philosophy, it tends to seek answers to the really big, general, perennial questions.
The kind that go all the way back to Plato.
Exactly. What is the best life for a citizen?
Right.
What is true justice? It's often very abstract, very foundational.
The ultimate big picture questions.
Right. Whereas political theory can be seen as a sister discipline that, might focus on clarifying specific operational concepts for political scientists.
So more applied.
A bit more applied, yeah. It might analyze something like voter apathy or the practical implications of a certain constitutional amendment. But really, both fields rely on the fundamental concepts we're about to discuss, starting with the absolute prerequisite for politics, the state.
The state. It's the defining feature of political organization, but what is the philosophical definition we need to be working with?
That's most basic. The state is an organized political entity. It's an association of people, citizens, exercising control over specific territory and implementing the rule of law.
Okay, that's the textbook definition.
But philosophers tend to characterize the state in one of two major ways, and this split immediately reveals the core tension in all of political thought.
All right, give us the two poles.
So the first one, you could argue it's the most cynical, sees the state as a necessary evil. It focuses on its most essential feature, the monopoly on violence.
The monopoly on violence.
This characterization emphasizes coercion. It's about the subordination of the will of the many to a dominant few who maintain order through force, or, the threat of force.
That sounds dark. It's all about fear and control.
It is. It's the perspective you find heavily in realists like Machiavelli or Hobbes. But the alternative, more optimistic view sees the state as a social contract.
Established for mutual benefit and security.
Exactly. This view focuses on cooperation, on consent, and on the idea that individuals voluntarily surrender some freedoms to gain collective protection and stability. The entire framework of classical liberalism is built on this second idea.
Wow. So whether you view the state as fundamentally coercive or fundamentally cooperative, that dictates almost your entire political outlook.
It's a huge fork in the road. And we also need to distinguish the state from a few related concepts.
Like stateless societies.
Right. Stateless societies are just loosely ordered social groups without a central authority. Then you have the nation, which is a group of people sharing a common identity, culture, language, history.
And when those two things line up.
When that national identity aligns neatly with the state's political boundaries, you get the powerful and often volatile entity known as the nation-state.
So if the state is the political entity with borders and sovereignty, the government is the institution that sits inside it, operating the machinery.
Exactly. The government is the operational institution exercising control. And philosophically, there's an interesting distinction here, too.
Which is?
Some thinkers see government as an end in itself, like intrinsically valuable. Others see it purely as a means to an end.
Like peace, security, or prosperity.
Right. And many modern governments, recognizing the inherent danger of concentrated power, establish a constitution to outline their structure and, critically, their limitations.
And this is where the real constraint on power comes into play, isn't it?
It's the stabilization device. A constitution stabilizes the exercise of power, prevents arbitrary rule, and legitimizes governance while, in theory, safeguarding fundamental rights.
Which leads us directly to the concepts that make or break any political system, power and legitimacy. So let's define them clearly. What are we talking about when we talk about power?
In political philosophy, power is the ability to produce intended effects, to control what people and institutions do. And it's multifaceted.
Is that just brute force?
No. It can be based on consent. Think of the power of a charismatic leader people willingly follow. Or it can be based on coercion, like a tyrannical ruler.
So power is the raw ability to make things happen. But what determines if that power is justified? If we have a moral obligation to obey it?
That's legitimacy, the rightful or justified use of power. It's not enough to have power. You must have the right to wield it.
And how do you get that right?
Well, typically it needs to meet two criteria. It has to be acquired through established, accepted rules, like a fair election, and it has to be used for rightful, publicly accepted ends, like protecting the citizens.
So when a government loses legitimacy, even if it still has power,
it faces a crisis. Exactly. This is closely tied to authority, which is often defined as the right to rule, or the common belief that someone is legitimized to exercise power.
That's a crucial nuance.
It is. You can have authority, the accepted right to rule, without the immediate power to enforce it. And a tyrant has immense power, but zero legitimacy or moral authority.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we look at how different governments wield this power, legitimate or not, we get this huge spectrum of forms of government. Let's quickly run through the major ones.
We can distinguish them based on who holds the power. The ideal, for many, where power resides with the people, is democracy.
And even that has layers. You have direct democracy, where citizens vote on everything themselves.
Which is pretty rare outside of, say, a small community or a specific referendum.
Right. And then you have the indirect or representative model, which is what most of us are familiar with, where we elect leaders to make decisions for us.
Then you have the direct opposite, authoritarian regimes. These systems reject political plurality and suppress dissent.
And under that umbrella, you have autocracies,
where a single person holds absolute power, a monarch or a dictator.
And oligarchies,
where power is concentrated in the hands of a small, wealthy group.
And at the most extreme end of that spectrum is totalitarianism.
Yes. Totalitarianism is an authoritarian regime that seeks extensive control over everything, public and private life. A critical subtype is fascism, which adds this powerful nationalist and militarist ideology to the mix.
And beyond who holds the power, governments can also be categorized by the type of people making decisions.
Right. Rule by expertise or status. So you have aristocracy, rule by the elites or nobility.
Meritocracy, if those elites are chosen by skill and merit.
Technocracy, if it's technical experts like scientists and engineers. And of course, theocracy, where religious authority rules.
This all naturally leads to a key philosophical insight, which is the need to prevent the abuse of all this concentrated power. The mechanism for that is the separation of powers.
The genius of institutional design, popularized by Montesquieu.
Legislative, executive, and judicial. Why is this division so critical?
It's based on the historical reality that power corrupts. If you concentrate all three functions, making the laws, enforcing the laws, and judging who broke the laws in one body, that body becomes absolute.
Instant tyranny.
Pretty much. By forcing them to operate independently and to check each other's power, you make arbitrary rule much more difficult.
That system of constraint is enforced through laws. But even there, we have a huge philosophical split on where laws get their authority.
We do. On one hand, you have natural law theory.
The idea that laws should reflect some kind of universal morality.
Exactly, that there are moral principles inherent in human nature, and unjust law isn't really a law at all.
And this contrasts sharply with legal positivism,
which views laws strictly as human conventions. For a positivist, if a law was passed according to the established rules, it's a valid law, regardless of whether we think it's moral or not.
Wow. So that's the whole philosophical debate over our political obligation, our duty to follow the law, even when we think it's wrong.
That's what politics meets ethics right there.
We've established the framework of the state and its rules. Now let's talk about what the state is actually for.
Yes, the ultimate normative values that drive political action: justice, equality, and liberty.
Let's start with justice. It's this huge, complex concept, but how do philosophers break it down?
We generally look at three types. First, there's social justice. This is the big picture fairness in how wealth, assets, and advantages are distributed across society.
Is the system itself fair?
That's the question. And within that, you have the practical side, distributive justice.
This is about the impartial allocation of resources. Should everyone get an equal slice, or should it be based on need or merit?
Exactly. This is the philosophical foundation for real-world policy battles like progressive taxation.
Right. And then separately, in the legal context, we have retributive justice,
which is all about punishment. The idea that the punishment should be proportional to the crime, just deserts.
And this brings us to John Rawls, whose theory, justice is fairness, is one of the most influential modern ideas in this whole field.
It is. Rawls was trying to find a way to establish truly impartial principles of justice, so he proposed a thought experiment, the original position.
Right, behind a veil of ignorance. What does that mean?
You imagine a group of rational people getting together to design their future society. The veil of ignorance is that they don't know who they will be in that society.
You don't know your race, gender, intelligence, wealth.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Nothing. You're forced to be completely impartial, so you're not going to choose rules that favor the rich because you might end up being poor.
That's a profound idea. It forces you to step outside your own self-interest.
And Rawls argued that from this position, people would choose two principles. First, equal basic liberties for everyone, and second, the difference principle.
Which says
that social and economic inequalities are only okay if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. It makes justice inherently about fairness to the most vulnerable.
Justice is so closely linked to equality. But as you mentioned, there are many ways to define equal.
Philosophers map these out really rigorously. The most fundamental is equality before the law.
Same legal standards for everyone.
Then you have political equality, the ability to vote and run for office. These two are pretty widely accepted in modern liberal states.
But the real fights start with equal opportunity.
Yes. The ideal that success should be based purely on merit and effort, not on the circumstances of your birth. The government's role, in this view, is to level the playing field.
And the more radical goal is equality of outcome.
Right. This argues that all people should end up with similar levels of material wealth and living standards. This is the goal of egalitarianism. And the tension between equal opportunity and equal outcome is, well, it's one of the defining arguments of modern politics.
Shifting gears to liberty or freedom, there's a distinction here that you said defines the split between classical and modern political thought.
Yes, Isaiah Berlin's famous dichotomy, negative liberty versus positive liberty.
Okay, break that down for us.
Negative liberty is pretty straightforward. It's the absence of external obstacles. It's freedom from. The state protects you from theft, from aggression, from interference.
Like freedom of speech. The government can't stop you from talking.
Exactly. Positive liberty, on the other hand, is the power or the capacity to act. It's freedom too.
So freedom to go to college or freedom to start a business, things that require resources.
Precisely. Positive liberty suggests that a starving, uneducated person isn't truly free, even if they have all their negative rights, because they lack the capacity to achieve their goals.
And that sets up the major political dilemma.
It does. Does the law necessarily limit negative liberty, or does it enable positive liberty by funding things that empower citizens? That is the ultimate trade-off.
We now have the complete toolkit, the concepts of state, power, justice, and liberty. It's time to see how different ideologies tie these together into coherent political visions.
Yes, the blueprints. We're going to focus on 4 major schools, anarchism, conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, that interpret these values in radically distinct ways.
Let's start with anarchism. It's often dismissed as just pure chaos, but philosophically it's a profound commitment to liberty and equality.
That's the core. It rejects hierarchical systems and centralized coercive government power. It proposes a stateless society driven by voluntary cooperation.
They see authority itself as the problem?
A threat to individual autonomy, a perpetuator of power imbalances. For many anarchists, the state is basically a criminal organization.
And there's a spectrum of rejection here, right? It's not all or nothing.
We can distinguish between absolute anarchism, which says the state is always morally wrong, and contingent anarchism,
which is more pragmatic.
Yeah, it argues that states aren't inherently illegitimate in theory, but they always fail in practice. They always lead to corruption, war, and inequality.
And the focus shifts dramatically based on whether you prioritize the individual or the community in this stateless model.
Precisely. You have individualist anarchists, which includes the modern version anarcho-capitalism.
Or libertarian anarchism.
Right. They stress the absolute primacy of individual freedom and private property. They envision a society run on voluntary contracts and private defense agencies.
And the counter-tradition
is collectivist or socialist anarchism. They stress community, cooperation, and the collective ownership of resources. For them, true freedom can't exist if economic power is concentrated in private hands.
What are the major criticisms of anarchism as a practical blueprint?
Well, the main one is that it's unstable and just leads to chaos. That rejecting institutions creates a power vacuum and the strongest just take over.
And the utopian critique.
That it relies on an unrealistic view of human nature. That we're all just naturally selfless and cooperative, which history might suggest otherwise.
Okay. Moving to a school of thought rooted entirely in the past, we have conservatism, often associated with Edmund Burke.
Its core tenet is the preservation of traditional institutions and practices. It's driven by a deep skepticism of our ability to radically reform society for the better.
So the argument is that institutions like family, religion, common law, they represent the accumulated wisdom of generations.
They've passed the test of time. Drastic changes, guided by abstract theories, often destroy these valuable foundations and cause more harm than good.
So it's not strictly anti-change, but anti-radical, ideological change. They prefer gradual evolution.
Exactly. The focus is on prudence. And while the specific traditions might change from place to place, conservatives generally emphasize family, religion, national identity, and strong support for private property.
And they see private property as a safeguard against state power.
Yes, and as a pillar of stability.
What are the main philosophical criticisms of the conservative framework?
The primary one is that its resistance to change can stifle necessary social progress. By prioritizing the status quo, it can perpetuate deep-seated problems like systemic injustice.
And that it tends to reinforce established hierarchies.
Right, benefiting privileged classes by arguing for tradition when that tradition might be structurally unfair.
Let's turn now to liberalism, arguably the most successful political philosophy of the last 3 centuries, rooted in thinkers like John Locke.
Its core tenet is prioritizing individual liberties and rights, supported by the rule of law, tolerance, and constitutional democracy. It's grounded in a real optimism about human nature.
The belief in our capacity for rationality and self-determination.
Absolutely. The idea is that individuals are born free and equal, with natural rights. The government's main job is to protect those rights.
Yeah.
And economically, this almost always translates into support for some form of capitalism.
A free market economy.
Right. But here we have to return to that great divide we talked about, based on negative versus positive liberty.
This is the split between classical and modern liberalism.
Exactly. Classical liberalism wants a very limited state. It focuses almost exclusively on negative liberty protecting individuals from government interference.
The night watchman state.
The night watchman state. Its resurgence today is often called neoliberalism. The counter-evolution is modern liberalism.
Which is more aligned with social democracy.
Right. Modern liberals argue that purely negative freedom isn't enough. They emphasize positive liberty. They believe the state must take an active role in fostering the conditions, like education and healthcare, that allow everyone to achieve their potential.
The sources also highlight libertarianism as being closely related to classical liberalism, almost like its philosophical extreme.
It is. Libertarianism emphasizes the non-aggression principle above all else. They want to limit government strictly to defense, police, and contract enforcement, and they disapprove of almost all wealth redistribution.
Finally, we come to socialism, a complex family of views focused on collective ownership and equality.
Yes, offering a fundamental critique of that liberal capitalist arrangement. The core idea is that the means of production, factories, land, major resources should belong to the people in general or the workers, social ownership.
Their main motivation is creating structural equality.
Right. They're highly critical of how capitalism leads to huge accumulations of private wealth, which they see as reinforcing unjust class systems.
And of course, the most influential school within socialism is Marxism. We need to clarify what Marx actually argued.
Marxism offers a systematic analysis of history and economics. It centers on the idea of historical materialism, that economic forces drive history and society is defined by class struggle.
And for Marx, in capitalist society, that struggle is between
the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie who own the means of production, and the working class, the proletariat who have to sell their labor. He argued this relationship is inherently exploitative and leads to alienation.
And he predicted this would eventually lead to a transition state.
Which brings us to the crucial distinction in his theory between socialism and communism. For Marx, socialism is the intermediate stage after capitalism.
The dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right. It's still centralized, still has a state managing resources. The principle is from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution.
And communism is the final stage.
Correct. The stateless, classless, final stage. It's characterized by material abundance and self-organization without a central government. The principle there is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
What are the main criticisms leveled against the socialist framework, especially that centralized model?
Well, economically, critics argue that central planning is massively inefficient. Without market signals like prices, you get poor resource allocation and stagnation. This is the calculation problem.
And philosophically?
Liberal critics argue that egalitarian redistribution fundamentally violates individual rights, especially the right to property, and that the massive state required for it can create its own new, powerful, bureaucratic hierarchies.
It's clear that political thought doesn't fit neatly into just those four boxes. Let's look at some other key tensions, like realism versus idealism.
This is a fundamental dichotomy, especially in foreign policy. Realism, which we associate with Machiavelli, asserts that politics is just driven by self-interest and the pursuit of power.
Pragmatism over morality.
Yes. Idealism, in contrast, asserts that political action should follow universal moral principles, like justice and human rights, to establish a fair social order.
Another framework is consequentialism or utilitarianism.
This is the idea that the moral value of an action depends entirely on its consequences. Classical utilitarianism argues the goal of politics should be to produce the highest overall happiness for the largest number of people.
Which can be a problem if it means sacrificing the rights of a minority for the good of the majority.
That's the key philosophical problem with it, yes.
This brings us to another deep conflict: the individual versus the community.
The battle between individualism and communitarianism. Individualism, which you see in liberalism, prioritizes the individual. Communitarianism, on the other hand, supports strong social relationships and shared values.
They would argue that without a strong community, the individual lacks meaning.
Exactly. That policies should foster public virtues and a shared life, even if that sometimes restricts pure individual liberty.
So how do philosophers actually decide which of these competing shoulds is the best way to organize society? What's the methodology?
It's a huge challenge. You can't run a lab experiment for justice, but they use rigorous logical frameworks. One is foundationalism, a top-down approach.
Start with a few basic principles and build a whole system from there.
Yes. Like Thomas Hobbes, who started with the premise that human nature is brutish and selfish, and from that, he justified the need for an absolute state to maintain order.
And the alternative, bottom-up approach,
is particularism. You start with individual moral intuitions about specific situations like it's wrong for someone to hoard food while others starve, and then you try to build a coherent theory from those judgments.
It's vital to remember that this entire tradition is rooted in antiquity. These debates are not new.
Not at all. Plato and Aristotle were defining the field 2,500 years ago, and the roots are global, far beyond the Western canon.
You have Confucianism in ancient China, emphasizing humaneness and benevolence.
And the mystical tradition of Taoism, which is sometimes associated with anarchism because of its skepticism of coercive authority.
And the opposing school of legalism, a purely realist philosophy of strict laws and punishments. It shows these conceptual challenges have preoccupied thinkers across all major civilizations for millennia.
So, we have completed our intensive deep dive into the theoretical foundations of political philosophy. We've outlined that essential toolkit, the concepts of state, power, legitimacy, and explored the guiding values of justice, equality, and liberty.
And crucially, we mapped the ideological blueprints that try to implement these values: anarchism, conservatism, liberalism, and socialism. The tension between these ideas is what defines our modern political discourse.
And we spent time on the methodology thinkers use, specifically that powerful intellectual device from John Rawls, the original position behind a veil of ignorance.
And that leads perfectly to our final provocative thought for you to chew on. Rawls forces us to confront our own biases.
It does.
If you truly had to define the core principles of a government without knowing your own place within it, without knowing your wealth, class, race, gender, or abilities, what fundamental institutions would you demand and why?
Think about it. Would you prioritize absolute negative liberty, knowing you might be born poor and unable to afford basic needs? Or would you demand a robust welfare state, ensuring positive liberty for everyone, knowing you might be the wealthy person who has to fund it?
Your answer reveals your deepest philosophical priorities.
It really does.
Think on that. That's the ultimate goal of political philosophy, designing the ideal society. You've just gotten the shortcut to understanding the blueprints. We'll see you next time